When I stepped into the dorm building for the first time, the scent of fresh paint mixed with something older, something like dust and plastic, as if the walls had soaked up decades of breath and bodies and late-night anxieties. The floor beneath me was scuffed from the weight of thousands of other students who had made this same walk, lugging boxes filled with pieces of their past lives, trying to fit them into a new one. I moved slowly down the hallway, dragging my suitcase behind me. It bumped along the uneven tile with a hollow rhythm that matched the thudding in my chest. The overhead lights flickered slightly, not in a dramatic way, just enough to remind me that this place was lived in, not pristine. Room 228. That's what the paper said. My new address, my new reality. I stood outside the door for a moment, staring at the numbers, letting the weight of everything settle into my bones. I had left home. I had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever came next, I had to meet it here, behind this door. When I opened it, the space felt too quiet. The room was split down the middle by design, each half mirroring the other. 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 closets. Identical layouts, perfectly symmetrical, yet somehow one side already felt claimed. I saw a backpack leaning against the far bed. A pair of shoes tucked under the frame. A half-filled bookshelf with titles I didn't recognize. My new roommate had already arrived. I stepped inside, slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. I took the bed closest to the door, not out of strategy, but instinct. It felt safer, like I could escape faster if I needed to. I dropped my suitcase and stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The room was small but not claustrophobic. The ceiling was low. The single window was shut, its blinds halfway drawn, letting in a fractured stream of late afternoon light. Everything was still. Almost too still. I began unpacking mechanically. T-shirts, jeans, toiletries. A stack of books I probably wouldn't read. I folded things neatly, placing them in the drawers, as if the act of organizing could calm the unease that had taken root in my stomach. I could hear the faint sounds of voices outside the window, other students calling to each other, cars rolling past, music drifting in from somewhere nearby. But in the room, there was only the quiet rustle of fabric and the soft thuds of drawers sliding shut. The air smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. Not strong, just a lingering trace. Clean, but masculine. A reminder that this was no longer a private space. I would be sharing every inch of it, this bed, this air, these silences, with a stranger. The thought was grounding and disorienting at once. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know if we'd get along, if we'd clash, if we'd barely speak. I only knew that we would be breathing in the same shadows for the next year. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank wall across from me. The corners of the room held shadows that hadn't been there a moment ago. Or maybe they had, and I was only now noticing them. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the dryness in my palms, and exhaled slowly. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something quieter, something that crouched low and waited for the right moment to rise. There was a knock on the door at some point, and then it opened. He walked in without hesitation, as if he already belonged here, and maybe he did. He didn't acknowledge me right away, just moved to his desk and placed a few things down. Then he turned and gave me a nod. I returned it automatically, unsure of what else to do. The moment passed quickly. He plugged in a charger, sat down, and started typing. The room adjusted itself around his presence like water around a stone. The rest of the evening unfolded in silence. I unpacked the last of my things. He made a sandwich at his desk. Our movements were cautious but not tense. We were navigating around each other, creating an invisible choreography of coexistence. There was something oddly intimate about it, this quiet negotiation of space and sound. Two strangers learning how not to collide. I didn't know what to make of him. He was tall, lean, moved with a kind of self-contained ease. He didn't speak unless necessary, didn't make noise, didn't fidget. It wasn't aloofness. It was control. The kind of control that draws a line and dares you to cross it. His side of the room was impeccably neat, books aligned, clothes folded with precision, every item in its place. It made me feel suddenly disorganized, even though I'd just finished putting everything away. As night fell, we turned off the main light, and each retreated into our corners. He had a lamp, warm and soft, that cast a golden circle around his desk. I had nothing but the dull glow of my phone screen. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the subtle sounds of him moving, a page turning, a drawer closing, the shift of fabric against his chair. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. I was hyper-aware of each sound, each breath, each tiny disturbance in the stillness. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling the same questions, none of them with clear answers. Who was he? What would this year become? What would it mean to live so close to someone I didn't know, couldn't predict, couldn't read? I turned onto my side and stared at the edge of his desk, just visible through the gloom. He was still there, focused, undisturbed, as if he didn't even notice me. Or maybe he did, and just didn't show it. Eventually, I closed my eyes and let the exhaustion take over. But even as I drifted off, I felt the tension in my chest linger. It was like standing at the edge of a new world and knowing that once I stepped forward, there would be no going back. Behind me was everything I used to be. Ahead was something undefined. And here, in this small, dim room, that transition had begun without warning. Something changed, though I couldn't say exactly when. It wasn't an event, not something clear-cut or obvious. It was more like a shift in atmosphere, like how you can feel a storm building before the sky darkens. I started noticing things, little things, that didn't seem important at first, but together, they began to form a quiet pattern I couldn't ignore. His gaze would linger just a little too long when I moved around the room. I'd catch it in the corner of my vision, feel it like a touch against the back of my neck. There was nothing overt or aggressive, nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." It was softer than that. Quieter. But it stayed with me. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my own discomfort, the way I wasn't used to sharing such a small space with someone I didn't really know. Maybe I was projecting, reading too much into casual glances and movements. But the feeling persisted. When I changed shirts, I felt exposed, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle awareness that I wasn't alone. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like vulnerability. Like standing too close to a window at night and realizing someone might be looking in. He never crossed any obvious lines. He never touched me, never said anything that could be considered inappropriate. But there was something in the way he carried himself, in the precision of his movements and the silence that hung around him like a second skin. He always knew exactly where I was in the room. If I moved toward the desk, he shifted away almost imperceptibly, giving space. If I entered while he was changing, he was already dressed. It was as if he had mapped my rhythms and adapted to them completely, never getting too close, but never entirely distant either. The nights were the worst. Lying in bed in the dark, I'd listen to the quiet sounds of his breathing, the occasional creak of his mattress, the soft hum of his laptop. And every now and then, I'd feel something shift in the room. A presence. A pressure. Something I couldn't name. It wasn't always clear if I was awake or drifting in and out of sleep, but sometimes I'd swear I felt him standing beside my bed. Just standing. Not touching. Not speaking. Just, there. One night, I woke up to the sensation of warmth near my legs, like someone had brushed the blanket lightly with their hand. My heart stuttered in my chest. I didn't open my eyes at first. I just lay still, every muscle tight, every breath shallow. The room was completely dark. I heard nothing unusual, no footsteps, no movement, but the feeling stayed, that electric sense of being watched, of being studied. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw nothing. Just the shape of his body in the other bed, turned away, completely still. I told myself it was a dream. A fragment of a restless night, my imagination playing tricks on me. But the unease didn't fade. The next morning, I found my blanket twisted around me in a way that didn't feel like my usual sleep movements. My shirt had ridden up to expose my stomach, and I had the faintest memory, no, not even a memory, more like a sensation, of pressure. Not pain. Not pleasure. Just a weight. Something had been there. And now it was gone. After that, I started becoming more alert. Hyper-aware. I noticed when he entered the room and how quietly he moved. I tracked the sound of his footsteps, the way he opened drawers without a single unnecessary noise. I watched how his eyes flicked to mine when he thought I wasn't looking. He was always so composed, so still, like he was trying not to be noticed. But I noticed. I noticed everything. There were moments when I questioned myself. Wondered if I was just paranoid, if all of this was in my head. Maybe I was just nervous, still adjusting to life away from home, still grappling with the strange intimacy of dorm living. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I could feel it under my skin, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. I carried it with me through the day, like an invisible weight. I stopped changing in front of him. I waited until he left or went to the bathroom. I started taking longer showers, just to have a moment of true solitude. I moved my bed slightly, only by a few inches, but enough to feel like I had some control over the space. I began to sleep with one ear open, waking at the smallest sound, the softest breath. He never confronted me. Never asked questions. But I think he knew. I think he could sense the shift, the way I'd become more guarded, more cautious. But he never changed. He maintained the same quiet rhythm, the same respectful distance that somehow didn't feel respectful at all. What unsettled me most wasn't any one thing he did. It was the fact that I couldn't prove anything. I couldn't be certain of what I'd felt, or what I hadn't. Everything lived in that murky space between sleep and wakefulness, between perception and reality. But my body remembered. And every time I walked into that room, I felt it tighten slightly, bracing for something it couldn't name. He moved like a shadow. And that shadow had begun to live in me, too. I couldn't shake it, couldn't outrun it. It stayed with me through lectures, meals, conversations. I smiled at people I barely knew and laughed when I was supposed to, but the tension never left. It curled up inside me, quiet and patient. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. There was nothing to say, no evidence to hold up to the light. Just feelings. Just that strange pull in my chest, that static buzz in the air when he was near. Just the memory of warmth where there shouldn't have been any, of presence in moments meant to be mine alone. And so I carried it, day after day, pretending. Pretending that nothing was wrong, that I was fine. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Something had embedded itself under my skin, a shadow that didn't belong to me. A shadow that breathed when I wasn't looking. A shadow that watched me sleep. That night, I made a decision without really understanding why. Maybe it was curiosity, or fear, or some strange need for confirmation. I told myself it was just to prove I was imagining things. To reclaim control over my own space, my own mind. I left the desk lamp on, letting it cast its dim yellow light over my bed and part of the floor. The shadows stretched across the room, soft and uneven. I crawled under the covers and lay on my side, facing the wall, trying to slow my breathing and keep my body still. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't close my eyes all the way. I let them stay slightly open, just enough to let the light trickle in. I wanted to see without seeing. I wanted to know without having to ask. Time passed slowly, stretching thin and taut. The sounds of the hallway faded as students settled in for the night. The hum of the building's heating system became a constant backdrop. I waited. My eyes began to ache from staying open. My body started to tense from holding the same position too long. I almost gave up, almost turned over and shut the lamp off, convinced I'd worked myself into paranoia. And then I heard the door open. He came in like he always did, quiet, efficient, purposeful. I heard the rustle of his backpack dropping to the floor, the soft squeak of his shoes as he slipped them off. For a moment, all was still. Then the creak of his chair, the subtle tap of keys on his laptop. It was routine, ordinary, unremarkable. I listened to the familiar rhythm, pretending to sleep, letting the illusion settle around us like a veil. But then the tapping stopped. Not abruptly, but gradually, like someone easing their foot off a pedal. The silence that followed was louder than any noise. I kept my breath steady, willing myself to remain still. My heart had already started its climb, slow at first, then faster, more urgent. I could feel the pulse in my neck, the heat rising in my chest. I didn't move. I waited. The chair creaked again, softer this time. Then footsteps, measured, controlled, moving toward my side of the room. They stopped short. I could feel the shift in the air, the way the temperature seemed to rise slightly, as if another body had entered my orbit. He didn't touch me. Not yet. But I could feel him standing there, close enough to count my breaths. Every nerve in my body was awake, tuned to the slightest change. The hair on my arms lifted. My muscles were taut beneath the blanket, ready to respond, but unable to decide what that response should be. I stayed still, not out of paralysis, but out of something more complicated. I wanted to know. I wanted to see what he would do. I needed to know whether the weight I'd been carrying was real or invented. He stood there longer than I expected. The silence became a presence in itself, a third thing in the room. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he watching me? Was he debating something? Was he waiting for a signal I didn't know I was supposed to give? The longer he remained still, the more surreal it became, like being caught in a moment outside of time. Eventually, I heard the soft shift of weight, his foot adjusting, his body leaning slightly forward. A faint exhale passed through the air, barely audible, but unmistakably human. I felt it against the back of my neck. My skin prickled. Still, he didn't touch me. Still, I didn't move. And then, just as quietly as he had come, he stepped away. The mattress on his side creaked gently, the blanket shifted, and the room settled again into its usual quiet. I lay there for a long time afterward, eyes open, heart still pounding. I didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, maybe longer, but eventually, I blinked and shifted slightly under the covers, just enough to release the tension in my shoulders. He was facing the wall now, or at least it looked that way. His back to me, still and unmoving. I turned to face the ceiling, the lamp's glow now softer, somehow more distant. I stared upward, not really seeing anything, trying to make sense of the experience. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. That moment replayed in my mind again and again, the silence, the breath, the heat. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. I had felt too much, noticed too many details. My body had remembered things my brain couldn't fabricate. And yet, without words, without actions, it was all suspended in ambiguity. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I got dressed, brushed my teeth, tied my shoes. He did the same, his movements calm and ordinary. We moved around each other like always, silent partners in a choreography neither of us acknowledged. But something had changed. I knew it. And I was sure he knew it too. I began watching him differently after that. Not just to track his movements, but to understand his silences. I looked for clues in the way he closed his books, the the way he adjusted his sleeves, the way he looked up when I entered the room. He gave nothing away. His face remained unreadable, his posture relaxed. But there was a subtle difference in how he occupied space around me. A quiet certainty that hadn't been there before. He never spoke of it. Never hinted at it. But I could feel it in the air between us, the unspoken thing that had been laid bare that night. I didn't know what he wanted from me. I didn't even know what I wanted from him. But I knew we were both waiting. For what, I couldn't say. A reaction, maybe. A decision. A confrontation neither of us was ready for. The room no longer felt neutral. Every object carried a new weight. The beds. The lamp. Even the carpet beneath our feet. It was all marked now, subtly changed by what hadn't happened but almost had. And every night since, I'd lie in bed wondering if it would happen again. Wondering if I would stop it. Wondering if I wanted to. There was no safety in routine anymore. Only ritual. I pretended to sleep. He pretended not to watch. And the line between pretending and truth blurred more with each passing night. That evening felt different before anything even happened. There was a strange stillness in the air, a kind of pressure I couldn't name but could feel pressing down on my chest. The room looked the same, everything in its place, undisturbed and ordinary, but I knew something had shifted. I moved through the routine of the night slowly, cautiously, sensing the edge of something I couldn't yet see. He sat at his desk, as always, back straight, headphones in, absorbed in whatever filled his screen. But his presence was too still, too composed. It didn't feel like focus. It felt like waiting. I changed in silence, my body turned slightly toward the wall, though I could still feel his attention. Not overt, not direct, but present. A faint awareness that settled on my skin even before his eyes did. I pulled on a clean shirt and climbed into bed. The air was heavier than usual, as if something unspoken hovered between us, suspended and electric. I turned off the overhead light and pulled the blanket up to my chest. His desk lamp stayed on. The soft glow painted a warm circle around him, leaving the rest of the room in shadows. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to hide. I could hear the faint clatter of his keyboard, the occasional sigh, the creak of his chair shifting under him. These sounds had become familiar over the past weeks, but now they struck me differently. I listened not for comfort, but for signs. I listened to the silence between movements, trying to read meaning in the spaces. Time passed. I couldn't say how long. Maybe minutes. Maybe more. At some point, the typing stopped. The sound didn't fade out gradually this time. It ended with a final tap, followed by silence so complete it made my skin tighten. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I kept my body still, curled under the covers, facing the wall, but my senses were raw and tuned to every shift in the room. I heard his chair slide back. The sound was almost nothing, but it filled the space like thunder. Then footsteps, quiet, careful, deliberate. I kept my eyes closed. I told myself not to react. Not yet. Not unless. I waited. The footsteps stopped at the side of my bed. I could feel the warmth of his presence before anything else. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I held my breath and stayed motionless. He didn't speak. He didn't breathe loudly. He simply stood there. Long enough for doubt to fade. Long enough for fear to become something else. Then the mattress shifted. Not a lot, not suddenly, just enough to know he had placed a knee on the edge. I felt the dip in the bed near my legs. The faint pull of the blanket. Still, I didn't move. I told myself I would stop it if it went further, that I would speak or shove or scream. But I did nothing. I lay there, suspended in silence, every nerve alive. His weight eased onto the bed. Slowly. Hesitantly. But without stopping. I felt the pressure of his presence behind me, not touching yet, but close enough that his warmth bled through the air and into my spine. His breath stirred the back of my neck. My body burned. Not from desire, not in any clear way, but from awareness. From the sharp edge of something inevitable. A hand settled lightly on my side. Not possessive, not rough, just resting. Testing. I didn't react. I felt the shape of his palm through the blanket, the pressure of fingers slightly curled, unmoving. The hand stayed there for a long moment, then lifted, leaving behind an imprint that lingered under my skin. There was no rush, no escalation. He moved slowly, like he was afraid of waking me or breaking the spell. Another shift in weight, and I felt the bed rise slightly as he pulled away. The air cooled where his body had been. The mattress returned to its shape. And then the quiet steps back across the room. When I finally opened my eyes, the light from his desk lamp was off. He was in bed, facing away. The room had returned to silence. But I hadn't. My mind was spinning. My body ached with tension. I stared at the ceiling, heart racing, mouth dry, skin still burning where his hand had rested. I didn't sleep. Not even close. I lay in the dark, thinking, replaying every detail, every movement, every second of stillness. I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I tried to tell myself I hadn't let it happen. But that wasn't the truth. I hadn't stopped it. I hadn't said no. I hadn't moved. And now I didn't know what that made me. In the morning, we didn't speak. We moved through the room like actors in a play neither of us had written. He brushed his teeth while I packed my bag. I tied my shoes while he checked his phone. We didn't look at each other. We didn't need to. Something had passed between us in the night, something silent and invisible, but undeniable. As I stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me, I knew I couldn't go back to how things had been before. Not because of what he did, but because of what I allowed. Because of the way I froze. Because of the way part of me stayed still, not out of fear, but out of something murkier, something I still didn't understand. The point of no return wasn't a moment. It wasn't his hand or the pressure of his body behind mine. It was the silence that followed. The decision not to speak, not to act, not to name what had happened. That was the real shift. The quiet acceptance that lived in me now like a second pulse. I carried that with me the rest of the day. Through lectures, through crowded hallways, through the buzzing lights of the cafeteria. I felt changed, though no one else could see it. I moved like a ghost in my own life, haunted not by him, but by myself. By what I had become in the space between sleep and waking. By the part of me that didn't stop him. The part of me that maybe didn't want to. In the days that followed, I existed in a strange, suspended state. Everything around me continued as before, lectures filled with scribbled notes, cafeteria trays lined with bland food, the muted hum of dorm life rising and falling outside our door. But inside me, something had gone quiet, like a switch had been flipped. I moved through my schedule like I was watching someone else live my life. I responded when spoken to, smiled when required, nodded at the right times. But behind my eyes, behind my skin, I felt disconnected. Like I'd slipped between two versions of myself and no longer knew which one was real. He acted the same. Polite, quiet, measured. There was no change in his movements, no shift in his tone. He gave no indication that anything had happened that night, no glance or hesitation that might betray acknowledgement. And maybe that was what unsettled me most. The fact that he could move through this silence with such ease, as if we were still just strangers forced to coexist, not two people tangled in a moment that didn't have a name. I started staying out later. I spent more time in the library, even when I wasn't studying. I sat alone on empty benches in the quad, watching shadows stretch across the grass, letting the wind press against my skin like a cleansing. I needed space, even if I couldn't explain from what. I needed distance, not just from him, but from the version of myself that had emerged in the dark, the one I didn't recognize. But no matter how long I stayed away, I always came back. Back to the same room, the same bed, the same silent routine. Every night I entered that space, I crossed an invisible line. One I couldn't see but felt in the tension of my shoulders, in the way I averted my eyes, in the way my breath caught when he stood too close. I had become hyper-aware of him, not just physically, but emotionally. I tracked every movement, every pause, every absence. And yet, I still couldn't say what I wanted from him. I didn't know if I wanted closeness or distance, understanding or silence. There were moments when I caught myself watching him. Not intentionally, not out of curiosity, but out of something quieter. Like I was waiting for him to make a move, or maybe waiting for myself to. Sometimes he looked back, and for a second, I thought I saw something in his expression, recognition, perhaps. Not guilt, not regret. Just a calm awareness of the space we now occupied. But nothing ever followed. No words. No gestures. Just the continuation of our quiet, unspoken rhythm. I found myself creating rituals. Not out of comfort, but out of control. I folded my clothes the same way every night. I aligned my shoes perfectly beneath the bed. I placed my phone on the same corner of the desk. It gave me structure, something fixed in a world that now felt fluid and uncertain. The room had become a stage, and every object on it had meaning. The distance between our beds. The angle of his chair. The position of the lamp. None of it was random anymore. It was all part of the silent choreography we performed without rehearsal. The worst part was the stillness before sleep. Lying in bed, eyes closed, heart open, unsure of what would happen or if anything would happen at all. Some nights passed without incident. He stayed on his side. I stayed on mine. The air remained undisturbed. But even on those nights, I didn't sleep easily. My body remained alert, my thoughts spinning. I would lie there for hours, listening to the silence, wondering if he was awake too, wondering if he was waiting for something like I was. Other nights, I felt him near. Not touching. Not crossing the boundary again. But hovering close enough that the line between us blurred. I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. Was that breath on my shoulder? Or just the fan in the corner? Was that the mattress shifting? Or just my heart playing tricks on me? I lay frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to stay. There was no map for where we had ended up. No guidebook for what this was. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know if it was abuse, or if it was attraction. I didn't know if I was complicit or confused. All I knew was that I felt something every time he walked into the room. A tightening in my chest. A heat in my spine. A question that never formed into words. I started to change how I moved. I became more careful, more deliberate. I avoided moments when I'd be exposed, physically, emotionally. I stopped leaving my towel on the bed. I kept my closet door closed. I changed in the bathroom with the lock turned tight. But even in those small acts of protection, I felt uncertain. Was I guarding myself from him, or from myself? The truth settled into me slowly. This wasn't about a single night. It wasn't about a touch, or a breath, or a moment passed in silence. It was about everything between those things. It was about the line we had drawn and how we now lived on either side of it, pretending it wasn't there while also refusing to cross it again. It was about the tension of restraint, the weight of what could happen but didn't. I lived in that space. Between fear and longing. Between silence and scream. Between innocence and complicity. It was a narrow, fragile place, but it was mine now. A liminal corridor I paced night after night, unable to turn back, too afraid to move forward. And so I existed on that line. Not on one side or the other, but inside the space between. I carried it with me through every breath, every glance, every hour spent in that room. It had become part of me, stitched into my skin like a second shadow. I didn't know how long I could live like that. But I knew, for now, I had nowhere else to go. The morning after felt strangely still, like the world had stopped moving during the night and hadn't started again yet. The soft light that filtered through the slats of the window blinds cast a pale glow across the floor, catching on the edge of my desk and stretching toward the middle of the room where the carpet dipped slightly between our beds. I lay there with the covers pulled up to my chest, eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer an explanation. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't afraid, not in the same way. But I wasn't calm either. I was suspended in something heavier than either, something that settled deep in my body, between my ribs, below the surface of my skin. He was already up, moving quietly, methodically. I didn't need to look to know that. I could hear the faint click of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of fabric, the low hum of breath held just below the threshold of sound. He never spoke in the morning, and I had grown used to the silence between us. But this silence had changed. It wasn't the careful, neutral quiet of strangers anymore. It was loaded now. Weighted. And we both knew it. I eventually sat up, slow and deliberate, like testing whether my body still belonged to me. My shirt was twisted, the hem rolled slightly up my side. The waistband of my shorts had shifted lower than usual. Nothing dramatic. Nothing visible. But my skin remembered. It remembered warmth where there shouldn't have been any, pressure that didn't belong to a dream, a presence that had pressed too close without speaking. There were no bruises, no marks. Just the aftertaste of something intimate that shouldn't have happened. I moved through my morning routine like I was underwater. The mirror offered no clarity. My reflection stared back, eyes dull, lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-thought. I splashed water on my face, trying to shake the numbness, but it clung to me. I couldn't feel the cold. I brushed my teeth too long, standing barefoot on the cold tile, watching the curve of his back in the mirror as he gathered his books behind me. Our eyes didn't meet. They hadn't since that night. And maybe that was for the best. Leaving the room was like stepping onto an unfamiliar street in a city I no longer recognized. Everything looked the same, the sidewalks, the buildings, the faces, but I felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. I sat through my classes, pen in hand, words forming on my notebook that I didn't register. I smiled when I needed to, nodded when professors called on me, but inside, I was far away. Disconnected. Hollow. I kept replaying the moment I woke up. The lightless room. The soundless pressure beside me. The absence of resistance. Not because I had been okay with it, but because I hadn't moved. I hadn't said no. I hadn't done anything. I lay there while it happened, and now I couldn't stop questioning what that meant. Did my silence give him permission? Did my stillness count as acceptance? The thoughts circled endlessly, each one colliding with the next, none of them offering peace. When I returned to the room that afternoon, he was gone. The window was cracked open slightly, letting in the muted noise of the world outside. I sat on my bed, staring at the desk where he usually sat, at the unmade sheet on his side of the room, at the objects he had arranged so carefully, keys, headphones, a pen resting on an open notebook. The ordinariness of it all made my chest ache. How could something so invasive, so personal, happen in a space so quiet, so controlled? I wanted to scream. Or cry. Or throw something. But instead, I just sat there, hands pressed between my knees, eyes unfocused. I tried to name what I was feeling. Anger? Shame? Grief? But none of those words fit exactly. It was more like disorientation. Like I had taken a wrong turn in my own life and ended up in a version of myself I didn't recognize. That night, I made my bed tightly. Hospital corners. A tucked-in blanket. Every fold precise. I placed my pillow carefully. I didn't want softness. I wanted control. I left the lamp on again, not as a signal, but as a boundary. A line in the sand. I didn't lie down right away. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time, listening to the hallway sounds, the distant voices, the slam of doors, the occasional laughter echoing down the corridor. He came back eventually. Quiet as ever. He didn't look at me. Didn't speak. He moved to his side of the room, took off his hoodie, sat at the desk. I could feel the air bend slightly around his movements, but I didn't turn toward him. I didn't acknowledge him. And he didn't try. When I finally lay down, I kept my back to him. My body rigid, my breaths measured. There was no sleep that night. Just the endless noise of my thoughts, the slow awareness of being watched even when I couldn't see it. He didn't approach. He didn't repeat the moment. But that didn't bring comfort. It brought something worse. The realization that it had happened once, and now could happen again. Or not. And both possibilities were equally heavy. In the days that followed, I said nothing. I spoke to classmates, I texted family, I joined group projects. But I didn't say anything real. Not about him. Not about what happened. Not about what it had turned me into. I told myself there was nothing to say. No proof. No violence. No bruises. Just a silence that had been crossed, a moment of sleep turned into something else. And who would believe that? He continued to act the same. As if nothing had changed. And maybe for him, nothing had. But for me, everything had. I couldn't unfeel the weight of his presence. I couldn't unremember the stillness of my body as it was touched. I couldn't go back to who I was before that line was crossed. I started looking into housing changes, even though the semester was well underway. I visited the office. I filled out forms. I didn't give a reason. I just said it wasn't working. They told me I'd be put on a waiting list. I said that was fine. I could wait. What I didn't say was that I'd already been waiting too long, for answers, for distance, for clarity that never came. Each night became a countdown. Not to another moment of violation, but to the possibility of it. The fear of it. The proximity of it. And that fear lived in my spine, in my breath, in the way I flinched when I heard him behind me. I didn't hate him. That was the hardest part. I didn't even know if I blamed him entirely. I blamed myself more, for being silent, for not moving, for not knowing how to say no without words. For not understanding what I was until it was too late. Now, I live in the after. Not the event, but the echo. The shadow of a night I didn't ask for, and the version of myself I found lying in its wake. He still sleeps across the room from me. Still breathes the same air. Still exists within arm's reach. And I still wonder if he ever thinks about that night. If he regrets it. If he believes nothing happened at all. But for me, it did. And I carry it now, every day. Quietly. Reluctantly. Relentlessly. Because no one teaches you how to heal from what never left a mark. No one prepares you for what it means to wake up and not be sure where your body ends and your silence begins.